So, ladies and gentlemen, please, if I can have you take your seats, I think we're about ready to start. So, I'm delighted today to introduce a slightly larger and illustrious panel. So we have Steve Rockcliffe, who's a marine ecologist from University of York, Willy Kosla, who is from Micronesia, and we have Lisa Svensson from Sweden, who's a Swedish Ocean Ambassador. Today we're going to talk a little bit about governance, partnerships, industry involvement. The main focus of today's debate is really going to be what are the different types of experiences. So our panel here has experiences from East Africa, from the Pacific and from Europe, and we wanted to sort of contrast some of the different types of experiences. I think I'll start with you, Steve, and give you a chance to explain a little bit what your experiences are.
So I'm a marine ecologist at the University of York, and I primarily work with NGOs and communities, and also the tourist sector to try and improve marine conservation in general. So specifically, I look at locally managed marine protected areas and how we can scale them, how we can finance them. And I was asked, as everybody else was today, to come up with three words. I tried really hard to get three, and I've actually got four, but we got pretty close there. So to describe my work, really, scalability, sustainable financing, and partnerships there. So, and when I was thinking about that this morning, it became apparent that actually two of those, especially, so sustainable financing and partnerships, are particularly useful when it comes to talking about meaningful and effective engagement in participatory approaches. Many of the LMMAs I've come across both in my work in East Africa and also in the Pacific region, they're the result of innovative partnerships between NGOs and local communities, and quite often a private sector partner as well. So partnerships and sustainable financing, both very important, I think, to this discussion that we're going to have today.
Thank you very much. Willy, do you want to give us a few experiences from Micronesia?
Thank you, Carl. I work for the Micronesia Conservation Trust, and I think having a trust and building an endowment is one of the ways that you can actually scale up your support for marine protected areas, because it does sustain those marine protected areas. It also gives the profile of marine protected areas a higher level within your government, when your governments and your communities are paying attention to an organization that has an endowment in the millions of dollars. And so I think that's why having a trust fund is a key tool in scaling up conservation.
And I think we'll get back a little bit more to the financing question later on, but I'll give Lisa Svensson a chance also to give us a few thoughts from the Northern European perspective.
Thank you. I think our experience was maybe not so much about what do you want to have, it was more about what you don't want to have. And when we created this marine protected area in Sweden, it was also to see what that area where the local population actually saw was happening outside the marine protected area. And the decision came really because engaging the community and collaborating with the community to get a movement that was rather away from that other development from the Coast Guard that we have seen. So I think in terms of collaboration, addressing the social and economic and environmental values, which are not always so clearly, but they are very interlinked, and finding a collaboration among the stakeholders, also in that marine protected area, but also outside. And this collaboration approach is something also that we are very much keen on in, for example, the regional conventions. We are very much involved, obviously, in the HELCOM for the Baltic, but also in the OSPAR convention, where we work very closely with France, for example, in working towards marine protected area. So collaboration within, but also between the protected areas.
So hearing you all, you're all talking about how we collaboratively, locally manage. I imagine there's a bit of a tension. A lot of people at this Congress are actually coming from a natural science background. Many of them have been trying to design the optimal system in terms of optimizing, for example, biodiversity or nature values. But you're all talking about really working with people and benefits to people. Now, do you see a tension here, and how do we actually work around that tension? And any one of you have thoughts about that?
Okay, well, I'll go first then. Thanks, guys. I guess I'm also a natural scientist by training more than I am a social scientist, definitely, though I do sort of dance down the line. I do interdisciplinary stuff, so I talk to local people and tourists about their perceptions of the marine environment, as well as doing the standard kind of underwater census stuff. I guess my view would be that there is right attention, but when it comes to local management, when it comes to kind of a bottom-up perspectives, really the natural science locating stuff, that's much less important. It's about working with the local community. It's about being there right at the start and throughout an entire process, making sure that you are engaging with them meaningfully, that you have clear objectives throughout the process, and that you scale whatever solution you come up with to the capacity and the social cultural context of that particular community.
Well, I think another key word here in this context is really about creating trust rather than fostering tensions. Because once the trust is there, the tension is becoming less, and vice versa. And for example, if you do have a protected areas where you're allowed to do fishery, but then other boats comes in and actually do fishing, and how do you actually control who can use the water and who can use those resources? That needs to be established a trust among the fishermen, for example, the local population living in the protected area, but also trust outside. So there is this beneficial creating trust. And how do you create trust? It's about transparency, and it's about, once again, collaborate and involving people in the process. And I think it's both, they have to be a top-down a little bit maybe, but it also have to be very much embedded in the grassroots movements, sort of. It has to be engaged in the local community. And the experience that we had from Sweden was really that it's a very keen, you're proud to be from this area. People know about the area. And when you're proud of something, you're also willing to protect it. And that's one of my keywords are really also the social and the culture aspects, which we sometimes tend to forget in terms of evaluating.
But if we look at the Swedish example, Kosterhavet, we have a situation where you're actually still fishing, and this is a national park. I mean, any other national park in Sweden, in fact, the first national parks on this continent were in Sweden. We have banned hunting, 100 years ago. Why is it that killing top predators in a Swedish marine national park is acceptable, but killing wildlife on land is not? Can you sort of explain that?
Because we don't eat the top predators.
Yeah, but we stuff them and we wear them, and there's all kinds of history of using them.
We don't do that in Sweden. You're welcome back.
Thank you very much. What I also wanted to say then is, how are we doing in Micronesia? Do you still feel that it's an easier situation? There's less tension, perhaps, between the local users and where we protect nature, given that many of the protected areas have been very large?
Yeah, in Micronesia, really the work has been done mostly with the local communities, with government support. We have some poaching that has been a result of people coming in from outside, but that's been very limited. The poaching or the over-harvesting of our local resources has really happened with the local populations.
If I just may add to that, and I think one of the key also essential elements in this whole debate is not about protecting and using. For us, it's not vice versa. Those are not against each other. We have to protect for using, but it has to be a sustainable use, because that's how we can sort of live in this sustainable world where we mix all the environmental, economic, and social aspects. So we cannot just block the evolution. I think that's not how we save ourselves.
Okay, but one of the things we want, to do with marine protected areas is actually have a reference point. We see all kinds of changes happening outside, be it climate change, be it other environmental factors that are changing over time. If we don't have a reference point, how can we ever get back to where we were? I mean, it's very hard to find your way if you don't know where you're going.
No, I do think you need reference point and you need a good cases in best practice. But the point is, where do you find the balance? I think the ultimate would be if you have a reference point where people and animal and nature works in harmony. And that actually means that we do need to have food. We do need fish to eat. We do need meat. We do need to have food to survive. That's a part of our being human being. So finding an area where you can have good example and showcase, I think that's very important. But I think also not only the marine protected area, but we also need to learning how to live in harmony in nature by looking at that. But we also have to take that with us outside the marine protected area, because we don't want to have a marine protected area where everything's in harmony, but whereas outside it's just really a black box.
You do need to have protected areas because traditional, what we're calling fisheries management traditionally and up to now really means over-extracting. And that's the practice that's been going on. And I know not just in Micronesia, but if you look at fisheries across the world, they're failing. So that means every time you're saying balancing sustainable harvesting with protected areas or with conservation, that hasn't really happened. So we have to have some protected areas in place, as a way to save some of these things that we're talking about. There are things that we can do sustainable harvesting of, but there are also, species and habitats that have been so destroyed that we actually have to step in there and say we have to stop this. And one of the tools for that is to create protected areas around those.
So thank you. I mean, I had an opportunity to dive down the coast here a couple of weeks ago in Pocquerolles, which is in fact France's longest running marine national park here in continental France. It's 50 years old this year. And I must say I was struck, 10 years ago I had a chance to dive there also, and I saw many more of the groupers than I saw today. And there's not a shark to be seen. I talked to divers there, they haven't seen sharks for I don't know how long. I mean, isn't that extraordinary? We have, one of the few real pearls here within the French protected area system, and, large parts of the wildlife are gone. And then we have to ask yourself, aren't we doing something profoundly wrong here? I mean, with the types of wealth we have in our nations, can't we for once set aside a little piece that isn't going to be hammered down by the fisheries? I'm sorry to belabor this point, but at some level I just find it bizarre that we, as people interested in this can't even defend one little sliver of reality that can remain the same.
I think it's important, and that's wonderful that you have that experience, and I envy you for that. But I do think the point is also that we do need to work to have those utopia marine protected areas, but we have to work parallel with other processes as well. So we are working towards having not only marine protected area, but having the harmony with and balance with nature all over in the ocean along the coast, and linking the life on ocean with the life on land.
So maybe now's a good time to also talk about resilience. You had mentioned this earlier. As far as I can see, a lot of our resilience that we used to have in the system, its ability to adapt to rapid changes, has disappeared. What do you think we can do to sort of manage for resilience? And do you have some experiences, for example, from the Pacific?
Yeah, in some of the things that we're trying to do, setting aside protected areas, especially in areas where we know they're connected ecologically, is very important. For example, on the island of Palau, they're ecologically connected to an island in Yap that reseeds the corals every other 10 years. And so the work that we're doing in Palau also has to be spread into Yap, because we know that every 10 years that seeding happens. And if that, those are the kinds of connections that we're trying to work out. And so we need to set up protected areas that are ecologically connected.
Steve, maybe we'll give you a chance.
I mean, yeah, my experience of the Pacific, my main fieldwork is in the Cook Islands, and they have a network of locally managed marine protected areas there called Rawi, and they've had a great deal of trouble with the resilience aspect in particular. There are so many other factors at play other than just fisheries. That there's problems with extra coastal development, which has led to 20 large houses on the septic tank that was for one house, and that leads to all sorts of problems flowing into the lagoon. There are pig farms, there's effluent waste that as soon as it rains, and it rains a lot in the tropics, right? It pushes down through the watercourses and into the bay. So although they have these closed no-take Rawi areas, the kind of magnitude of other threats that they're facing is kind of dwarfing the benefits that those Rawi are having.
Just one example, for example, from the Baltic, and one of the problems is really the nutrition leakages from the agriculture sector. And that's one of the main problems have been the disappearance of the wetlands that can actually capture the nutrition before it comes into the Baltic. And that's very much how do you deal with those problems on land? By, for example, wastewater policies, establishing wetlands, working with the agriculture sector to establish best practices, methods in harvesting, etc. Those methods and those policies have very little to do while you're talking about marine protected areas in the ocean, but it does very much interfere and interlink with each other. So my point is that yes, you can establish and you should establish marine protected area, and we are very committed to going to the 10% goal. And we work very much with other conventions and countries in doing that. But that cannot be done in an isolated way. You have to work on different policy tools. You have to target the agriculture sector, which is one of the major challenges, but also the shipping transportation area. So that doesn't mean that you can do one and be happy with that and then showcase that you have done your targets and then sort of move on.
Maybe this is a good time to talk, though, about the whole idea of partnerships. I mean, clearly you need partnerships across the boundaries of protected areas. You also need to find mechanisms where the benefits are shared with the surrounding people. Now, what do you think are good examples of that? I mean, we haven't talked much about East Africa here, but there are a few cases there. Maybe, Steve, you want to mention something?
Sure, yeah. So my work in East Africa has been with a couple of research partners on the ground there. So Blue Ventures, who are a UK social enterprise, and Cordio, who are a not-for-profit research organisation. And we synthesised and reviewed all the LMMAs, all those locally managed marine areas that we could get our hands on in that region. And a few kind of key learnings have emerged, and there are some great examples Blue Ventures itself has helped to originate the Valandre marine managed area in the southern part of Madagascar. It's one of Madagascar's largest marine managed areas, and it's actually an IUCN recognised site as well now. And that spread from a couple of villages wanting to control the octopus fisheries and up into this massive great managed envelope with no-take areas within it. And it's replicated so much with so little effort and with so little cost that there's something like 35 LMMAs across Madagascar now. And as a result, those areas under local stewardship are about 4 times larger than those areas under government traditional top-down. So it's been a real success story.
Do we have perhaps other partnerships you would like to mention?
Yes, in Micronesia, we're looking at the whole system, and so we're going from what we're calling the watershed approach, and we've created some watershed alliances that have incorporate, the protected area systems in these watershed alliances. And so, if when you have, an areas, and because we all know that species don't have boundaries. We have to create these watershed alliances so that we can all deal with.
And what kind of partners do you have in those type of arrangements? Who are the different actors?
The different actors include the traditional owners of those watersheds, government, non-government organizations, and of course organizations like mine that provide, the support for those alliances.
Lisa, do you have any other Scandinavian partnerships you want to mention?
I think, there's obviously many of them, but we do have, one partnership collaboration is really to see how the land once again links into the ocean, and what we do on land matters and vice versa. And you need to establish relationship and understanding between those two. So there is Ocean Meets Lands is the name, and that's really about how do you interact and how do you plan for all the different resources. And then, of course, this links into the whole maritime spatial planning. How do you plan and how do you sort of negotiate all those different demands for the resources out in the ocean? And who is actually the one to make the final decision? Where should we have the wind park? Where should the defense have their interest? Where should the tourism, where should the fisheries be allowed? So you need to have this overall holistic maritime spatial planning ID when you go into those collaboration partnership. But also, once again, we do have the regional conventions that I mentioned, and in the OSPAR, we are working very much closely with the HELCOM, which is the Baltic Sea Convention. And that works also have to be done to other regional conventions. I think we have to strengthen that collaboration. And at the same time, within the different maritime protected areas, you also have to link the knowledge in one protected areas to other protected areas. For example, the Swedish eel comes from Sargasso, and you may think that it's very far away from Sweden, and I do think that there are many Swedish people who's not aware of it. So you also have to spread the awareness, the literacy and the knowledge, and disseminate that to the public and to the consumers, so they can make those choices.
So we talked about a number of partnerships. You're mentioning also the idea here of marine spatial planning. And clearly outside of Europe, it's less common perhaps in thinking those terms. But of course, there is various division of users. And so in other parts of the world, for example, in the Pacific, what do you think have been good ways of assigning user rights or traditional types of rights? And how is that evolving? I mean, do you finding new techniques or new ways of doing it?
Well, we don't actually assign user rights because we still have the traditional communities that actually still own their resources across Micronesia and in most parts in the Pacific. So, you know, that zoning is not really something that has been successful in terms of doing a regional or national zoning of areas. But we do work with the different communities within their local areas to look at where they can set aside and you know, where they can continue to use.
But you do have areas which are closed off for fishing, either temporarily or permanently. You have areas where certain types of things are taboo and so on. So I mean, there are, in some ways, a zoning system. It's just perhaps not formally called that.
Yes, and yeah, we do have protected areas, no-take areas all across Micronesia. And it's part of what the initiative called the Micronesia Challenge. That's all the partnerships at the regional level.
And looking to East Africa, I mean, we have experiences also there where there is clearly a different type of users that are assigned, but sometimes I have a feeling in East Africa there's a weaker institutional base and local interests can be pushed aside as well, or it's easier to sort of have central government withdraw certain types of traditional rights.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the big difference there is that there is no history of customary tenure generally in East Africa, so there is not really that much evidence that local people have managed their resources in the past beyond a few kind of sacred forest areas, a few kind of taboo areas. And whatever there would have been was somewhat destroyed in the legacy of colonialism. And recently, we're starting to see this happen, and it's happening in a much perhaps less formalized way than it has done in across the Pacific, with a whole variety of different models and different sizes. But yes, we constantly find that the legal framework isn't perhaps there, and the kind of institutional enabling factors aren't really there in the same way. So there's a very successful network, which I'm sure many of you guys will know, the LMMA network in the Pacific, and we've tried to replicate that in the Western Indian Ocean, and amongst other things, to facilitate exchange visits so people can learn from what's worked in other parts, but also to kind of to lobby for greater decentralization of marine resources.
And of course, one of the best ways to make people believe it is not having a bunch of scientists being sent to the place, but having them observe other villages doing something that actually works. And I think your example from Madagascar is a good one here. How do you actually see us scaling up these type of things? And one of our big challenges, I think, is that we're still doing things, how should you say, at the hobby level in some places, or a little bit beyond that, but it's not really having a huge impact on how things are being managed. What are the techniques we have to scale up management in such a way that it becomes the mainstream or relevant?
I mean, it's a tricky one for sure, and I guess in part opposition to what you just said. As I mentioned earlier, in Madagascar, they've actually done a pretty good job of scaling up on their own to a point where the numbers of the area under management is far greater. Same kind of deal in Tanzania. The area under management, collaboratively managed areas, is greater than the government management by quite a long way. I think with this kind of thing, it does require long-term engagement. It's, you know, and engagement right from the start, and that's not an easy thing to do. And clearly it's prohibitively expensive to engage with every coastal community that you can possibly get. So yeah, I think if you get the model right, you know, if people see what other people are benefiting, then it can kind of scale that way. But I don't have any kind of magic bullet for suddenly getting a much larger amount of LMMAs. I think that these learning networks are really important. And I also personally think that if you're in coastal areas where there are tourism operators, so hotels, that kind of thing, that you can work with them for enforcement and management and financial support. That's happening in the Cook Islands, and it's, as I said, the examples there aren't perfect, but the ones that have the involvement from the tourism operators are performing much better than those that don't.
And there perhaps we have interesting examples like Maldives, where a number of islands are now starting to become de facto small marine reserves. Around the 105 or so resorts, every single one of them has a no-take area. But there's also an exchange with the local villages in the neighborhood to make sure that they have an engagement and involvement in the broader management. So I think there are a number of these cases where we see. I guess my question here is, you know, are there things we can do to speed up the self-replication? So, you know, you don't need to have outsiders involved all the time. You give local people tools, and then they can apply it themselves, and they don't have to have, you know, constant input. Because what I'm afraid of is we have systems that require money to be infused on a continuous basis. And once the money gets withdrawn, you have a collapse, and you've basically lost what you were there to protect. I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, in our discussions in the session earlier today, we talked about the fact that the best way to scale up the work that we're doing is to make it part of the culture. And because once it becomes part of a culture, then people will do it without having to be paid to do it. So for example, if it becomes something that you do as part of your culture to put protected areas in place, then you wouldn't have to have a whole lot of support coming from the outside, especially with financing, to galvanize these communities to move on getting their conservation work done.
Yeah, it's a little bit what I mentioned in the beginning, that the people in this protected area in Sweden is really proud about living there, and they want to expand it for the moment because they do see the benefits, not only economics, but they're really proud of the brand that it has created. So that's really important. But I do think, coming back to the question of maritime spatial planning, in the Baltic Sea we have 2,000 ships every minute, and those demands on the Baltic Sea and the ocean have to be sort of collaborate or linked into all the other different demands on the ocean in terms of tourism, shipping, aquaculture, fishing industry, where we put the waves and ocean energy, etc. And this is a tremendous huge challenge. And how do you balance, and how do you negotiate, and how do you collaborate, not only within the Swedish local authority, but also across sort of the bay, where we have, we have Russia, we have Finland, the Baltic states, and Denmark and Germany, and how do you cooperate with different countries around such a sea? And you need a lot of, obviously, patience, but you also need to have established trust and transparency in exchanging information. And that is, of course, to the Baltic, but that could also be applied into a marine protected area, that you need to establish this transparency and trust in the system.
So when we all go back next week, what are we actually personally going to do here to make sure that the world becomes a better place when it comes to marine environment? Do you have a one-liner that you would like to share with us, experiences that you think you will be able to apply coming out of this week?
Well, I actually got here today, so perhaps I will come back to that tomorrow.
William?
Well, this sustainable financing has been the thing that's helped us to move forward many of the initiatives that we have in Micronesia. So for me, it's going to be continue to help build these mechanisms that help the communities move forward on what they're doing.
I think starting already next week, everybody could think about on Monday when they get back into the office or in the ocean, whatever they belong, is that, what are the best practices and best cases that I heard of that I'm curious to learn more about? And I wanted to invite myself into that group of people. And you may not be obvious relevant from the outside, but just learning in the groups that you think are the challenger and the forerunners, and bring that perspective back home and just start a process. And you may not be the successful process, but you start a very interesting outcome. And for example, in the Baltic, once again, we do have all those challenges, as I mentioned, including the ice breaking during the winter season. And there is a lot of stakeholders come to the Baltic and look at how do we deal with the Baltic, because that's something that they have to deal with in the Arctic while the ice is gone. That's something that the same challenges have to be addressed in the Arctic. And that's a few years ahead, but we know the time running fast, and I think our session is soon gone.
That is also true. One of the experiences I've had is comparing the Baltic to the Bohai Sea. You know, the Bohai Sea off the northeast coast of China has a lot of similarities. It's relatively shallow, lot of economic activities, quite rapid growth, a lot of population, brackish water part of it, and there is, I think, some lessons to be learned. I mean, both of them have been severely modified by human activities, and I think as ecosystems they leave a lot to be desired. But on the other hand, I think they have taken completely different methods in terms of how are they managed. So there's a contrast here between, on the one hand, command and control and central government just making a lot of decision, and on the other hand, perhaps trying to work up partnerships and across the sea. So you have in some ways very different types of political and governance settings, but you share many of the same types of problems. And I think one of the experiences you have in a place like this is to be able to exchange ideas about how do you do this, and what are the things that seem to be working, what isn't working in other places, and then build the informal networks that help us to actually take action down the road. So anyway, I'll give you one last chance to, if you have any other message you wanted to leave to the audience before we end today. Should we start with you, Steve?
I guess I would say that we actually haven't talked that much about meaningful and effective engagement in this particular thing. I just say that it really is it really has to be done right from the very start. You have to involve the community right at the very start and throughout that process, and that you need to have clear objectives. It's just the same as it would be in any business. You don't have any objectives, you don't know where you're going, and that finally. It's really important. The capacity thing is so important. I've worked in the Cook Islands where the capacity is very high, and the work we've looked at around the Western Indian Ocean, often the capacity is much lower, and you need to scale to that capacity, not just the capacity of the communities, but also the capacity of the governments, because they're probably going to be involved somewhere along the line as well.
The communities need to know that they're being listened to and that they're going to be benefiting from. We can all work with their pride to help them start up. But Bright is not going to continue to keep them focused on this if there were no concrete benefits to them. So that's where we need to get to.
Lisa?
I think being a diplomat and negotiator, you should always go for the people, the stakeholders that have an energy, that those are the ones that actually have a personal drive that you can utilize for your own purposes, so it becomes a win-win situation. And by that, I mean, for example, in a marine protected area, who are the stakeholders or persons or individuals that are very engaged in these regions, and what would they find, what would they come out of it if you would sort of establishing a marine protected area?
Thank you very much. I think we had a rich and I think quite diverse panel, and we brought out a number of the interesting questions that we're all grappling with. I just wanted to, as we end this, make a plug for this evening at 6:15. William Windram will be showing his white shark film. This is actually a guy who tags white sharks for a living, and he dives down, free dives, and actually puts a tag on them. And I think this is quite a remarkable film, and you're all very welcome to come in. So I think we'll end with a round of applause for our illustrious panel.